and there's now a punishment by the IOC's investigation committee in view of the overall claim of state-run doping, according to the McLaren report, all you are aware of from 2016. What we experience at the moment is a quite interesting debate with a German advocate, Teilmann, who claims and stresses that Alexander Neckov never personally has been tested positive for doping. First example. Second example, Colin Kaepernick, who files a lawsuit against the National Football League owners in view of collusion. That is especially interesting since he never managed it since his protest to get to any team since then. A third example, also quite interesting, just saw us around the last few days, the Danish women's football team that experienced some kind of protest, and the Danish Football Association that was forced to cancel a women's qualifier against Sweden. And we experienced that throughout the last day. A settlement has been achieved, which guarantees the Danish football team a 60% increase in the salaries of the women players and some additional loan. And the fourth example from the last days, or from the last weeks, the Hungarian Hungary taking place, the gold medalist swimmer Antinka Hosszú, she announces the launch of a global association of professional swimmers. Four examples very much up to date, which reveal very well how hot, how ongoing this topic is in the last few weeks. A more general glance at what happens in football. Football seems to be a little bit beyond the scope of these kind of activities, since football employees are usually considered to be among those who receive the most highest salaries. But if we take the fifth global employment report from 2016, we see some kind of other perspectives. Just a couple of statistics: up to 14,000 footballers have been asked in an opinion survey from in total 45 countries. Unfortunately, no feedback from English, Spanish, and Germany, but many other leagues have been involved. And around 41 of those players who have been asked experienced delayed salary payments over the last 2 seasons. To add a couple of more statistics, the median net income of those who have been surveyed is not a million or billion euro or dollar, but it's between $1,000 and $2,000 per month. Over 6% of the players who have been asked have been forced to train alone, and at least 22% are aware of this kind of strategy from their own past. And 10% of the players have been threatened by fans, club management, or other professionals throughout their career. I think these statistics are quite interesting, especially in view of the countries. I'm not sure whether you're able to see all the different countries over here. High rates, especially in Africa, but also countries like Scotland, who are not well known for some kind of bad reputation, are among those who are identified with some kind of bad governance. So what is going on in professional sport? In general, a couple of comments. We experience since many decades an increasing commercialization and medialization of sport. This has led in the more recent years to a higher amount of conflicts in organized sport with various kinds of sports. National associations and also the European confederations are challenged to some extent by the players or the athletes that experience this kind of deficits and practice these kind of protest activities. Traditional unions are not really interested in these matters. They do not engage, at least in most countries, while players and athletes establish their independent athlete representations with different kinds of variations. Team sport at the moment, or the last decade, has taken the lead, and more other organizations do emerge. Amateur sport also adopts some kind of this mechanism in view of trying to establish their own interest representation. What is even more interesting, that some kind of adaptations from the US sports systems emerge, especially in view of what has taken place over there in view of lockouts and strikes. This is the overall starting point and proceeds. And if we have a closer look at a couple of organizations on the left, those who emerge in the German system, that is specifically our, at least at the moment, we have the traditional VDB, VDV, the German football organization that is more a service organization and less a union. But we also experience in handball, in basketball, and other kind of team sport, new organizations that have emerged. And we have on the other side already a couple of organizations as on the international level, at the European level, as for instance World Players United, US-led, but also FIFPro and others who have undertaken or increased their activities. I don't go into details with the different structures and activities. I just want to remind you that many of these organizations have just been established throughout the last decade. Here we have a closer look at the fields of activity. We see a long range where those organizations are active and where probably in the near future further problems will occur. We have the problem of general working conditions. We have different kinds of modes of employment, formal modes and informal modes of employment. We currently witness the problems of payment conditions, and has been already pointed out by the FIFPro General Survey. We should have a closer look at job-related capacities. What about disability? The very important role of player agent and their role within the social relations in sport. We have the increasing debate on the role of the CAS and on the sport-related legislative measures. We are witnessing debates on contracts, on standards of contracts, minimum contracts in sport, a matter that has already been experienced some treatment at the European level, the question of gender equity, the situation of young players, the matter of dual career, the qualifications throughout the professional career, some kind of security and insurance systems, and also the schedule of player and athletes. A long list that is not complete, but which shows how relevant this is. Now, in view of the short time that has been given to us, I want to draw your attention to at least 3 scenarios in view of short-term, medium-term perspective for professional sport as well as for amateur sport. First of all, legal conflicts. That is what we experience at the moment. An increasing number of legal conflicts that occur. National labor law is very often addressed. Specialized attorneys are active in this field, and players or athletes become more and more aware of the need to have some kind of professional support in view of attorneys, but also in view of independent organizations. The existing associations or the federations or confederations just react quite hesitantly or cautiously. Some topics have been covered by UEFA and others, while others are completely ignored or left out. For instance, aspects like player agents or the schedule in professional handball, that is high on the agenda, while other activities are hardly into consideration. The clubs are also active in these fields, but very much looking for some kind of loophole, some kind of flexibility, especially in reference to the national league. Nevertheless, we experience some kind of professionalization of clubs. They enhance their communication and cooperation with the association. Second perspective, that are the medium or long-term scenarios for professional sport, and that might be more interesting also in view of the topics that have already been covered earlier in the day over here in this conference. We experience an ongoing professionalization of interest representation of players and athletes. We experience that independent institutions have been organized and established, own offices, own secretaries, not necessarily at the same place, our debate earlier today, where national associations are located. We experience still an important role of legal experts, but also a growing number of conflicts in the medium time future. Governments will take a closer stand in these kind of activities. There we can experience experience that governments will intervene and will regulate at least some of these activities due to the pressure on governance, due to the number of ongoing conflicts, and we will experience that there will limited number of exceptions, as for instance in terms of minimum wages or other activities. What is even becoming more interesting is the Europeanization of interest representation. More activities take place at the European level. The European Commission will intervene, will use the social dialogue, besides the dimension of co-determination and other activities, by taking into consideration elements of the G14 experience. My last slide, and I hope I can at least briefly show that some things will differ from professional sport in view of amateur sport. We'll experience that national governments will even closer or stronger intervene in this aspect. There will be a high pressure again on the national governments that leads to some kind of higher intervention in these fields. The clubs will reorganize their structures with some more legal expertise in the board, with more full-time employees in view of what's going on in view of social relations. And we will experience also on the amateur level a higher degree of self-organization that has especially taken place in view of the coaches that have established their own organizations. My final comment is we will experience a general trend to new modes of conflict and representation, and that will take also place in view of the academic world. We experience that a couple of publications have been launched throughout the last years, which deal closer with the question of nominations and so on. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Jürgen Mittag from the Cologne University? Sport University, sorry. Thank you very much for that interesting presentation. And now we would like to welcome another one from the Sport University of Cologne, Maximilian. Seltmann, Research Assistant. Welcome.
So, thank you and welcome to my presentation with a fairly long title. I want to read it out just quickly. Employment relations within the Olympic movement, consequences of the monopoly power of organized sport. Because of the limited time, I can certainly not cover every aspect of the research I've done in the last year, but I want to provide you with a narrative and an analytical assessment of why we see so many of these issues, especially in the Olympic movement, as Professor Mittag has already shown. So that's the main goal I want to share for today. So we are all aware of this system of the Olympic movement with the IOC at the top, and all the way down we see the athletes. And we've already heard today in the panel session that there is a cleavage between the business orientation of the IOC and its movement character, its goal to enhance values, and its basis on a voluntary membership. And I think it is because of that that we also see that there are no legal contracts, or at least not all steps of this pyramid are covered by legal contracts. So athletes are oftentimes not covered with any legal representation towards their employer, if something like that exists in the Olympic movement. This also yields that we need a more general understanding if we want to understand the Olympic movement as an industry that provides a certain good and sells it. I argue that the good of the Olympic movement is sporting excellence, something that millions of people watch around the world and marketed and owned by the IOC and marketed through their platform of the Olympic Games. For most of sport disciplines, this is the most important and most marketable event that generates the most income for most of the sports disciplines. However, we see that it is the athlete who takes the crucial part in producing the good of sporting excellence. It is the athlete who produces, but the IOC who owns and then markets. How this production is in a sense, organized shall be illustrated by that picture. So that model is rooted in principal-agent theory. I don't want to go into too much detail. However, we see that the IOC is the main owner of that platform, of that industry, but it can't produce sport himself. You mentioned Thomas Bach in the long jump. I don't think it would work. But what they do is they delegate the task to other bodies, namely the NOC and the international federations, that then again delegate the task to the athletes. So again, the athlete's position is on the one hand not clear, but also fairly powerful in all that, in all this process of doing sporting excellence. The question then is, what consequences does it have for the athlete that these bodies, all three of them, are monopoly powers? I want to give you some examples. We have heard already a lot of examples from my professor, but I want to show that, that the one big issue is that the sport organizations can impose unfavorable rules for the athletes. We might all have heard of Rule 40 of the IOC charter that gives constraints to athletes in terms of their sponsorship activities, and we all have heard on issues dealing with nomination rules. I think a German javelin thrower, because she tried to sue the German Olympic Sports Confederation last year after she has not been nominated for Rio. So there is this basic decision: if you act in a monopoly setting or in every kind of delegation, do I follow my agent in that model or do I not follow? The athletes can decide to not follow, and in that theory it is called agency slack. So agency slack is a behavior of the athlete in that sense that is unpleasant or undesired by the principal. And that thing is a very strong feature of that model, agency slack. However, the sport organizations can do something to prevent and to cope with agency slack. And we see that this is very, very strong, what they can do in a monopoly setting. So what they can do, we've talked about the lack of legal coverage on the regulations. So sports organizations can circumvent this problem and impose new regulations. Claudia Pechstein, German speed skater, has called this somewhat obscurious freedom to sign that athlete's agreement she had to do for the Sochi Olympics in order to start. Again, it is the decision, do I sign or do I not participate? And the second thing, if agency slack in fact does happen, so if athletes do not comply to the rules of sport organizations, the sport organizations can and do, as we have heard, apply sanctions. We might all know this picture of Emma Glinto-Garo in Moscow 2013. Her agency slack was that she made a political statement against the anti-homosexual propaganda law in Russia by painting her fingernails, and she was said to remove her nail polish in order to start in the finals, which she did. And the explanation for that is that in a monopoly setting, the athletes face infinite costs of agency slack. Imagine Emma Glinto-Garo did not, or just stayed with her nail polish, she would have not been able to start. Her informal contract with her employer would not be into place anymore, and she would have, in that sense, lost her job and could have gone nowhere else to offer her service of being a high jumper, because there's just no other platform where she could offer that. So the monopoly position of sport organizations makes agency slack very unlikely. So she has removed her nail polish, and we see that before taking the sanction of being banned forever, most of the athletes usually comply with the rules. However, we cannot stay with this picture or I don't want us to stay with that picture, because I think that building on the strong positions of the athletes, we have to extend that framework, that athletes are in fact veto players in this entire industry. We have heard from Professor Mittag that athletes are actually doing something about it. There are involvements in terms of athletes commission, which would mean athletes are veto players inside the system. They have somehow a formal vote to agree or not agree. However, we also find that this is very unsatisfactory for the athletes, and there is a lot of work to do for the athletes to regain a strong position. And we've heard that unions have been formed and different modes of representation are currently still evolving. So two ways of how athletes can make use of their strong position even in a monopoly setting. I want to add a third dimension by introducing him and asking what would have happened if he did this. So if Usain Bolt painted his fingernails in Moscow 2013, would he have been banned, or at least threatened to be sanctioned in a way that he cannot start? I think it is the power of stars in that industry, and we also have theoretical backing for that when we apply things like their added value, that they can reinforce the strong position of athletes in that specific chain of delegation. So, wrapping up, we see that the consequences of the monopoly power of organized sports lead to an unstable system where athletes are not satisfied because it is a monopoly power and they have nowhere else to go. There is an infinite cost of agency slack, and that makes agency slack very unlikely. However, athletes are veto players in that field. We see that through the commissions and representatives, through unions, where they try to achieve something like collective bargaining, and in the end also the power of the stars can be very helpful for them to regain their position. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation, Maximilian Seltmann from the University of Cologne, Sport University. Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce the next speaker. He will speak about embedding the human rights of athletes in world of sports. His name is Schwab, Executive Director for the World Players Association, UNI Global Union. Is that pronounced right? UNI Global Union. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I just need some slides. Well, thank you. And I'll be able to pick up some of the key thoughts that were made by the previous two speakers, embedding the human rights of athletes in world sport. I think it's fair to say that there's a human, and not just an athlete's rights, but a human rights crisis in sport. We've seen that, of course, just by way of example with the situation of migrant workers in Qatar, and the previous speakers have already spoken, for example, about the FIFA Global Employment Report, where we're learning about the sexual abuse of gymnasts in the United States, and the duty of care report in Great Britain indicates that the current governance of sport is certainly failing athletes and players in many ways. The question is, why is this the case? And if we talk about what a player union is all about, it's about organising players so that they have an equal say in the conditions and the terms that affect them, so that from that position of an equal say, they can build a strong and prosperous industry and a career path for their members. Players at the national level are treated very differently, however, than they are at the global level. At the national level, they're regarded in many countries as employees, as workers entitled to the protection of employment and labour law. This means that they have the right to appoint people to negotiate for them, people of their own choosing, and exercise the right to organise and collectively bargain. And the affiliates of the World Players Association have certainly been able to develop a position of leverage where they would enjoy an equal say in the governance of their sport. The sporting organisations, of course, are regarded as cartels, and therefore they're subject to anti-competition law, or at least a monopoly in some instances. Therefore, if they unreasonably restrain the trade of players, or they act in an anti-competitive way, then the players will take legal action to ensure that their right to pursue their trade freely is upheld. If we compare that, however, with the global situation, it's in stark contrast. What are players? What are athletes? Well, that's subject to the regulation which is unilaterally imposed, and it's enforced through compulsory arbitration in the Court of Arbitration for Sport. Even the idea of a notion of representation is regulated. Athlete commissions and athlete committees are creatures of the regulations of sport, therefore they can be dispensed with through the regulation of sport, in stark contrast to an independent players association. And the sporting bodies themselves are not only not subject to anti-competition law, but they're given the privileged status of being looked at somewhat with the notion of autonomy. Antoine Duval of the Asser Institute describes this, that in the absence of international rules imposed conjointly by national states, the football world has developed, and this can apply to all international sports, in the shadow of the important Bosman case and Swiss arbitration law, a specific global law without the state. It's a very powerful notion that these sporting organisations, whose governance we've just been questioning next door, have the power to make law which is binding and which can override national law. How do we deal with this at the global level? Well, at the World Players Association, we're committed to doing so through collective action, not only through the 85,000 athletes that belong to the 115 player associations that are part of our effort, but also with human rights groups as part of the Sport and Rights Alliance, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the International Trade Union Movement, and with a multi-stakeholder approach, which includes the governments, includes the UN, the ILO. It is through collective action and a multi-stakeholder approach that we can start to bring to account some of the wrongs that we've seen in the world of sport. The framework for doing so is the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, a document that was set up in 2011. It provides that the government should protect the human rights of its citizens, that business should respect human rights, and where human rights of people who are affected are not upheld, there should be access to a remedy. This means that sports need to do four things. They must adopt a human rights policy. They must proactively undertake a human rights due diligence to identify risks to human rights and take necessary steps to mitigate and prevent those risks from materialising. Where necessary, affected people should be able to access a remedy, and there should be ongoing engagement and communication with affected groups in relation to human rights. This is a very different model to the unilateral model that we were just hearing about from the previous speakers. What are internationally recognised human rights? Well, of course, we're thinking about freedom of speech, aren't we, in terms of the examples that Maximilian just mentioned. But they include the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the two international covenants, the ILO Declaration on the Fundamental Principles and Rights of Work, which includes the right to organise and collectively bargain, and the UNESCO Charter, which provides that access to sport is a human right, and also that where athletes and workers, they're entitled to the protection of the recommendations of the International Labour Organisation. Due to collective action, we are now seeing sports embrace their human rights commitments, at least on paper. The 4 sporting organisations in that slide, FIFA, UEFA, the IOC and the Commonwealth Games Federation, have all taken proactive steps towards embedding within their governance framework the fundamental human rights of everyone affected by their activities, including, of course, the athletes. The sports ministers of the world did likewise in Kazan this year in the 6th meeting of the World Sports Ministers, convened by UNESCO. Quite interestingly, in relation to the integrity of sport, the sports ministers said we're going to move away from policing athletes, and that the number one step in terms of preserving the integrity of sport is to safeguard the rights of athletes in accordance with the United Nations Guiding Principles, and that the good governance of sport includes athlete oversight, and that athletes clearly need safe spaces to train and compete, free of abuse, sexual exploitation, misconduct, exploitation in employment situations, trafficking and violence. The FIFA human rights policy adopted in May states that it's legally binding, and therefore the human rights commitments of FIFA are binding on all FIFA bodies and officials when exercising their respective powers and competencies, including when interpreting and enforcing FIFA rules. It may well be, therefore, that we have the opportunity to enforce, through this global law that exists without a state, a just and a fair legal system that's human rights compliant. But in order to do that, we need to reform the Court of Arbitration for Sport. Professor Ruggie, the architect of the United Nations Guiding Principles on Human Rights in Business, examined FIFA in April 2016, and his report For the Game, For the World, which I recommend to everyone in this room in order to quickly understand how United Nations standards are to apply to sport in relation to human rights, said that the Court of Arbitration for Sport and indeed football's dispute resolution system need to be reformed so that they can address human rights claims and that the arbitrators have a human rights expertise. And in keeping with the UNGPs, that review should be undertaken in partnership with representatives of players and other users of the system. So where does that leave sport? At the World Players Association, we've adopted what's called the World Player Rights Policy. And every sporting organisation simply needs to do 4 things in order to start moving forward. The first is they need to adopt a player rights policy that upholds internationally recognised human rights standards, and they need to make it binding. They need to proactively undertake a human rights due diligence. It's the onus on the sport to assess its rules and its activities for the likely adverse player rights impacts, as opposed to what's traditionally been the case, where athletes have had to threaten careers and their livelihoods in order to challenge these monopolistic systems. Sport has a duty to act proactively and assess itself. Where those 2 steps are not necessary, affected people must be able to access a remedy. We helped a Muslim basketball player, Bilqis Abdul Qadir, who could not play because she wanted to play in a hijab. FIFA simply needed to ensure that she could play sport without being discriminated against. And finally, sport must proactively engage and communicate with the legitimate representatives of the affected groups, which of course include the players. I'll leave on one thought. There are volumes of legal documents in world sport that impose onerous obligations on athletes. None guarantee their fundamental human rights. There's now a consensus between the IOC Athletes Commission, or the IOC I should say, WADA and the World Players Association, that there needs to be an internationally binding declaration or charter of athletes' rights. That's what we're working towards, and hopefully within the next year or so we'll be able to announce an agreement for that document to be part of world sports law. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Brendan Schwab. Very interesting presentation. And now I'd like to welcome the next speaker, Nikki Dryden, independent lawyer from Australia and Olympian, former Olympian, or maybe Olympian still. I don't know how to say that. But welcome, Nikki.
All right, so I think I need to start a little bit more about who I am, and how I got here. So I am an Olympic swimmer, just like ILC member Dick Pound. I competed in Olympics in swimming. Just like Mr. Pound, I'm also an attorney. But how I arrived at this place is different from there. So I first played the game was in 2006, and I was very inspired by the journalists and activists who came here, including Laura Robinson and Andrew Jennings, who sort of took me under their wing to show me the real side of the Olympic movement. In 2008, I got involved with an activist group called Team Darfur because I was appalled at the situation in Darfur, and we believed that we could use that as leverage. The Chinese government's involvement in Darfur could be leveraged ahead of the Olympics. But what happened was my colleagues had their visas revoked, who were part of Team Darfur. Active athletes who were members of Team Darfur were threatened by their national Olympic committees that if they didn't remove their name from our website, they would be not able to compete in Beijing. Other active athletes on the U.S. Olympic team were blacklisted by the Chinese government. And the message from the IOC members was that athletes needed to shut up and go home. So from there, I've now been involved in several Olympic campaigns since then, mostly with Human Rights Watch ahead of 2012 to allow Saudi women to compete in London, and then on LGBTI rights ahead of Sochi. So I think that things have changed, and I would be remiss if I didn't say there was some positive change in the last few years. I never thought I'd say that at Play the Game. But you know, the last 3 years has been pretty incredible for human rights in sport. Both FIFA and the IOC have accepted this whole concept of human rights in sport. The IOC's Agenda 2020 actually uses words like good governance, human rights, and improving gender issues. FIFA, I think, has really taken the lead in this area by hiring and engaging with the UN expert to outline a human rights policy. Brendan's already alluded to FIBA overturning their head covering ban. And then we're going to hear from Kristen Morley tomorrow about the Cycling Federation's agreement to change its policies on XY female athletes and gender verification. So all of these changes are very positive, but none of them could have happened without the people in this room, the journalists, the academics, the activists, the lawyers, and the few athletes, and I say few, and we'll get to that sort of at the end as to why there's so few athletes that are able and willing to speak up. Brendan's already mentioned UN guiding principles, and I think it's important just to understand why sport has changed a little bit. The world human rights regimes changed first in 2011 by adopting the UNGPs on business and human rights. And what happened is some of those corporate sponsors that were involved in the Olympic and sporting movement, they started implementing and embedding human rights in their supply chains and throughout their businesses. And so the corporate sponsors did not come willingly necessarily. They were not involved ahead of Beijing or 2012 to implement human rights or even talk about it. But once the UNGPs came out, it empowered corporations to start living this. And they, including most prominently Coca-Cola and Adidas, have been real leaders bringing the sporting movement along with them. So what's happened at FIFA, there's some great things in theory that have happened. We've got a human rights policy that was passed by the council and approved earlier this year. We've got, which is the first for international sports. I think we have to mention that. And the Human Rights Advisory Board is external, which is extremely important. It's got 8 members who are well respected in the human rights movement on that advisory board. But we also have to remember and put it into context. All of this talk of human rights and adopting human rights policy does come at a time when FIFA is going through a governance and corruption crisis. So we have to make sure we hold them accountable for the human rights commitments that they've made. The advisory board did put out a report earlier this month. It's quite extensive. I think and it addresses quite a few of the shortfalls. It's important for you, again, for the documents you need to see what FIFA has been doing, but what they still need to do. And it's very important that all of you hold them accountable. I think the big issues, which again have been touched on by a few other speakers, Jens in the earlier session, of the 22 members that voted for Russia and Qatar, only 12 of them are already gone based on corruption, alleged charges and other offenses. So we already have a system of, there's still a lot of governance problems within FIFA, which is a huge problem. In Russia and Qatar, the human rights situation is quite dire. 50% of the workers on the Russian 2018 stadium builds are migrant workers, and there's allegations that they are treated like slaves, including workers from North Korea who receive no payments at all. In Qatar, there have been some improvements, as we heard last night, but the real test is now. The workers are increasing from 12,000 to 36,000 in the next year. There's already was 8 deaths in the last 2 years on construction builds, and the big issue is this concept of workplace-related deaths. So not just deaths from construction, but all the environment that they're working on. And we also have heard about migrant workers in Qatar who are treated like slaves under the kafala system. Skipping now to the IOC, so 2020 improvements, Agenda 2020 improvements, human rights are now built into the hosting contracts, but not starting until 2024. They have improved their transparency of financials, which is a welcome change. They're working on diversifying the IOC membership and some changes to the Ethics Commission. But, there's still a lot of failures that come with Agenda 2020. You just have to start with the actual working groups that came up with the recommendations. There wasn't a single committee or working group that had more than 50% women. Some of the working groups had no women at all on them. But they did have some of the superstars of global corruption right now. Diak, Hickey, Ahmad, and Fredericks were all members of those working groups and are all part of corruption scandals going on right now. While Agenda 2020 did have a sort of gender theme, and which is welcomed, the IOC remains an old boys club. The IOC members are still not equal. They've been working on this for over 35 years, and I just counted this morning, only 28% of IOC membership is women. In reflecting on last night's presentation, I think it's really important to know that women's groups did draft and the IOC did adopt sex harassment and abuse policy several years ago, but there's no enforcement mechanism. There's no remedy, as Brendan was discussing, which makes it useless. The IOC has also engaged an external institute to help them, mostly on their governance issues. They issued a report also this year with 33 recommendations. Their biggest concern, transparency issues with the Solidarity Program, which is what Yen was discussing, headed by Sheikh Ahmad, who is that co-conspirator number 2 in the U.S. federal investigation. He's still an IOC member, still working in the head of the Solidarity Program. Two other important recommendations are the sanctioning power that needs to be given to a third party. So the IOC board is, as all of you know, the most powerful group of people in Olympic sport, and they, right now, all the power and decision-making lies with the e-board, and it really needs to be given to an external or third party. The other thing is the Ethics Commission right now has no teeth to do anything until something is referred to them, and obviously that needs to change. So the membership itself is a huge problem for the IOC. They've also got China to worry about. Those changes are not supposed to come into effect on the host city contracts until after Beijing hosts the 2022 Winter Olympics. Obviously pretty devastating that they were awarded those games after failing completely to uphold any of their promises to change human rights ahead of the Beijing Olympics. I think China is worse off today than it was before Beijing 2008. The lead up to the Beijing Olympics saw forced eviction, secret prisons, government censorship, jailed activists and attorneys. Some of those activists are still in jail today or under house arrest, almost a decade after they were arrested prior to the Beijing Olympics. Okay, so what have you been doing for the last 10 years? They've been in jail because they were fighting to uphold human rights in China. The big problem, and it's being alluded to many times over this week, is that there's been no change to IOC structure, governance, or membership, and the oligarch continues. They're convicted criminals, plagiarists, nepotists, royals, billionaires, and misogynists. My big problem is that the positions are still filled by volunteers, which are only privileged elites, or those who are then alternatively susceptible to bribery and corruption. You know, the autonomous nature of sport makes it impossible to coexist with nation states. You know, athletes are coerced into arbitration at the CAS, and traditional rulemaking and legal justice systems can't be accessed by athletes. Where are the athletes? So I mean, we sort of know what's happening, right? Athletes aren't given the opportunity to participate truly in governing or rulemaking. This whole idea of athlete representations on committees is a joke. All of them swear allegiance to the entity that they are representing, not to the athletes. And I think that's really important to understand, because this idea that athletes are being represented is totally untrue. This is a smokescreen, and it's really important that we find a different way for athletes to be represented through meetings and other players' associations. Then athletes who do want to speak out can't, because of the Olympic gag rule 50.2 that says that no one can speak out at the actual Olympic Games, meaning no one can speak out on behalf of themselves or other people whose human rights are being violated. So, and then the worst situation is that there's no grievance mechanism, which means that there's no remedy available for those who do speak out. So I think there's probably a lot of consensus at this conference that we need to overhaul the leadership structure, the membership, and the governance. I've said it before, and I will continue to say it until things change at the IOC. We also need to fight to end sports autonomy. That will be the most difficult one, because I think that's the basis of all their power, is that they're able to operate separate and apart from all the legal systems around the world. We must lift reforms from paper, because otherwise human rights abuses will continue. And I know that I can't let sport be in the service of repression. If I were to be competing still and knowing that people were dying in stadiums where I played soccer, I'd be pretty upset with that. So we need to speak with one voice, or all of this is going to be for naught. All the work that we've done and how far we've come, we don't continue to put pressure on the powers that we need to continue this change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nikki Dryden, for your speech and presentation. I really hope that you will be interested in discussing this afterwards. And all of you on the floor, please raise your questions just after our last speaker. And the last speaker of this panel is Play the Game Award recipient. Recipient. Yes. Laura Robinson from Canada. And Laura, you will speak about, or your presentation is called Not Above the Law, using human rights laws to address abuse in sports. Thank you. Your floor is yours.
Okay. On January 17th, 2017, the Canadian Human Rights Commission accepted a complaint from members of the Lake Babine First Nation in northern BC that alleged they had been discriminated against on the grounds of race and on the grounds of their place of origin. The complaint is against the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, who are they police rural Canada, as well as being a national police force, the Ministry of Public Safety, who oversee the RCMP, and the Ministry of Sport and People with Disabilities, and the Ministry of Heritage, which encompasses the Ministry of Sport. Sport is sort of a junior ministry in Canada. And then, on November 10th, 2017, Hereditary Chief Marianne Perry filed a different complaint at the BC Human Rights Tribunal on behalf of her brother Richard Perry, also a hereditary chief from Lake Babine First Nation. This complaint was made against the University of British Columbia after they chose to utterly ignore First Nations people who wanted to speak with them about their choice of John Furlong, who was the former CEO of the Vancouver Olympics, as a keynote speaker at a varsity sports event fundraiser on February 17th. And this first shot is actually of the protest, the morning of the fundraiser breakfast. And I just really like the use of the FU there. So anyway, we'll go on to the next slide. Yes, I went to slide 2. So anyway, so they went, this is the Human Rights Commission. There was also There was also a protest the day before at the university's, at the president of the university's office, where this slide, where this poster was. But I'm not going to speak about that. I'm going to address the complaint at the Federal Human Rights Commission. But my paper that I'll give Play the Game will link to both complaints if you want to read both of them. So on November 26, 2015, the Lake Babine First Nation members wrote to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He just got in as the new Prime Minister of Canada, asking for Furlong to be removed as chair of Own the Podium, which is the organization responsible for putting Canadians on the Olympic and World Championship podium, and told the Prime Minister they wanted to meet with government representatives so they could find a remedy to the decades-long wounds that they said were inflicted when they alleged that Furlong had abused them during his tenure as a Catholic missionary in northern BC, and then again when he started turning up in the media as the CEO of the Vancouver Olympics, which was around 2005. And because he had taught at both the Indian day schools and at an Indian residential school in the 1960s and mid-70s, which he did not disclose in the hundreds of interviews he did as the CEO of the Olympics. This is just a shot, by the way, of Lake Babine, which, by the way, the Catholic missionaries, French missionaries, if people speak French and they know that means a sort of an animal lip. It's a derogatory word, and that is what missionaries called the women, and that is what kept. And that's not their name. Their name actually means those who live further up. But they were forced off their land and put into Burns Lake. This is Central Station in Burns Lake, and 1,000 kilometers north of Vancouver. And not only were they forced off their land, which was then given to actually Miranda and a number of other mining and lumber companies, but for every native child that went to the Catholic schools, the diocese received funding from the government. However, you can see when you're there that they have tried to make their voices heard. So 7 months after the initial request, I'm sorry, I've got a paragraph ahead here. Here we go. By November 2015, when the Lake Babine First Nation community wrote to the Prime Minister, approximately 60 people had alleged Furlong had either abused them, they had witnessed him abusing others, they had reported his abuse, or others had reported his abuse to them. As of today's date, November 27, 2017, the Prime Minister has not responded. 7 months after their initial request, the Minister of Sport, Carla Qualtrough, sent a letter to Kathy Woodgate, who had written the original letter on behalf of a number of members. But unfortunately, the facts that the Minister Qualtrough cited were completely incorrect. And Ms. Woodgate was actually devastated by the dismissive letter. Other Lake Babine members gave up and declared that Canadians would always be racist and would ensure their abuser not only went free, but was awarded because he had successfully abused so many First Nations children. So this is how other people felt. This is Ronnie Alec. He's another hereditary chief. He wrote an affidavit about the abuse he experienced and others experienced. I want to clarify that 6 people alleged sexual abuse, and the other allegations were very serious violence and racism. This is Ronnie West, another hereditary chief, also who wrote an affidavit saying that he personally wasn't abused, but he witnessed the abuse of others. So in December 2016, Furlong's former students also wrote to the IOC and to the mayor of Calgary, Naheed Nenshi, asking both the IOC and the city to not entertain a 2026 Winter Olympic bid as long as Furlong was the chair of the Canadian Olympic Committee's new big committee. An excerpt of the letter reads as follows: "We suffered PTSD, depression, anger, hopelessness, and it was all made worse when instead of listening and meeting with us, Own the Podium, the Canadian Olympic Committee, the City of Vancouver, the Province of BC, and the Canadian government pretended we did not exist. That is when the hopelessness became worse. We used to run away from school as children. and tried to tell the RCMP about the abuse. But instead, we were beaten again for lying to the police. We are not lying. Furlong is the liar. Please do not make things worse for us. When Furlong was appointed by the Canadian Olympic Committee to chair the Calgary bid, that darkness returned. Please have nothing to do with these people. We invite the IOC to meet with us. We are a small group of the dozens who have come forward about his abuse. Your own Olympic charter disallows you from engaging in racist behavior. Please do not contribute to our PTSD and depression. Instead, you can help by demanding that the Canadian government thoroughly investigate how Furlong got his positions and why the RCMP did not investigate properly, and how we can find a remedy. We can't live through another Canadian Olympic bid with our memories of John Furlong. The IOC never responded to this letter. Well, the City of Calgary wrote only that the COC's committee was separate from theirs, as if a bid city cannot act with even a semblance of common humanity. On October 22nd, 2017, the complainants sent a more comprehensive outline of the complaint to the Commission. They requested that the Commission use the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as a lens through which they would analyze what a service to Indigenous people is, because they were alleging that they had been discriminated against in the provision of a service. Carolyn Bennett, Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs, told the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in May 2016 that Canada would fully implement the declaration. In July 2017, the Canadian government followed up on Bennett's commitment to the implementation of the declaration by publishing the 10 principles. And again, I will play the game those 10 principles, under which they would operate. The principles ensure that the fundamental importance of the declaration in the government's relationship with Indigenous peoples, as well as the calls to action in the recent Truth and Reconciliation Commission report on Indian residential schools, which Canada received in 2015, are part of those 10 principles. So in terms of the Lake Babine First Nation complaint, there are particular articles within the declaration they have cited to show that they were discriminated against. For the sake of brevity, I'm just going to mention one, which is Section 2, subsection E of Article 8, and it reads that states shall provide effective mechanisms for prevention of and redress for any form of propaganda designed to promote or incite racial or ethnic discrimination directed against them. The reason Article 8 is cited in their complaint is that every time Furlong is endorsed by the federal government in a position of power within sport, it makes the First Nations people who have tried to have their abuse allegations heard appear as if they are lying, which is a stereotype a lot of people in Canada have about Indigenous people. Because why would a government that is committed to truth and reconciliation ever hire an abuser of First Nations people? So Furlong's very presence in the public realm then becomes a form of propaganda working against Indigenous people. Comments were often made that Furlong students were lying in order to get more money, as if money somehow dropped out of the sky if First Nations people told untruths about probabilities. Right now, the Commission's lawyers are analyzing the arguments made by Lake Babine First Nations members under the UN Declaration and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. These are exciting times in Canada as the UN Declaration is utilized as a tool for human rights, and we see whether or not the federal government will actually walk the walk on truth and reconciliation in Canadian sport. I'd just like to add that on December 5th in the House of Commons, Romeo Saganash, who is a member of Parliament, he's a 10-year survivor of residential school. He's Cree, he's from Northern Quebec. His private member's bill on adopting the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as of last week was supported by the Liberal government, and I'll definitely be in the visitors gallery cheering on Romeo Saganash and the Liberal government. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Laura. And now As we were starting out a little late, I know that now you're also running a little late, but we'll open the floor for around 10 minutes. I really hope that some of you have some questions for this inspiring panel. So, yes, already to first you.
Yes. Michael Carcase, and I work with a players' union for pro cyclists. My question is about trying to establish representation through a players' association. If you have an international federation that has an athletes commission, how to deal with the athletes commission? Do you engage with it, try to co-opt it, do you try to ignore it and marginalize it when the federation uses the athletes commission to marginalize the independent athletes association? So how do you, if anybody has any thoughts on that, how do you propose you deal with the athletes commission?
Yeah, we will take the 3 questions first, and then we'll try to answer the questions. Okay? You.
My question is for Maximilian. You explained that athletes have a kind of veto right, which I think in paper is correct, but have those rights enforced in practice? I work with Vipro and assistant Boston, and for him and many other athletes who try to stand up for their rights, so they don't agree with you to get the solution for that.
And Nikki working from Human Rights Watch. My question is a variation of that because we've seen how difficult, almost impossible it is for athletes, even at the top of their game, Olympians like Nikki, Dryden, top players that Rindum represents. They have to make enormous sacrifices. They have to wait for years and years if they are going to see any type of justice. So what are the solutions here? Let's move the discussion very concretely into what are the solutions. I feel like there is momentum for this process, but it's still the case that any of the athletes who want to challenge an injustice must be prepared to sacrifice their career, and that's totally wrong.
Thank you very much for that question. Or comment? Yes? Just.
I think it's important to ask the question because is it in line with previous 2 questions? And in order to try to answer maybe your question from my position, because I'm as they are represent similar as colleagues from the Sport University, I think and the question for the panelists is this existing structure of sport, pyramidal structure of sport, and mainly at the national level, is this a major obstacle for athletes' voices to be heard? I can draw you one of the examples, in my country's athletes are now starting to establish the clubs as being in legal terms, only way to be directly involved with the governance bodies such as GA, General Assembly, Executive Board, within the bodies that decisions are made. So my question is, do you think that it's time to repeat the middle vertical-based structure of sport?
Sorry, but we'll just give it a floor to you. We'll start. Yes?
Yeah, thank you very much for this important question, because I think we are really at the turning point of this overall development. And your very complete question, how are things going on? The organizations, the federations, the associations, they want to keep it inside, to keep it in the family. That's quite clear. And what is needed is some kind of pressure. Pressure can derive from different perspectives. On the one hand, it can come from national governments who are to a limited extent. I agree with you, who are just to a limited degree interested in. Secondly, they can come from non-governmental organizations and from some kind of public pressure. I think this might be most relevant because these organizations are really interested in integrity and social relations, and they can at least express some kind of pressure if they are able to raise more general public awareness. And this leads to some kind of new development and trends, and this is a crucial point. Considering the first question, I think the Athletes Commission have not really the power to change the situation. Some kind of cooperation or communication might be relevant, but it's very much up to independent organizations, or to these partly independent organizations, to exceed some kind of powers and some kind of structure. And that's a crucial point. And now we are very much within our discussion. What are relevant powers? And we have to distinguish between team sport and individual sport. We have to distinguish between popular sport, legalized sport, and sport which is less relevant. We have to differ between some kind of sport where we have some kind of very professional, very popular players and others. And if there in the end some kind of professional representation, but also some kind of solidarity, which is a really difficult term in terms of sport, we can at least expect that some kind of changes will occur. But that's a long run. That's a long run. The most crucial point to conclude is public pressure and some kind of intervention that takes place.
Yeah, you need to start at the end. Basically, the players want an equal say in the decisions that affect them. Secondly, they're entitled to be represented by people or organisations of their choosing. These are two fundamental points. Now, there's no history of any players' association at the national level, if we look at best practice, developing that degree of influence by working within the system, by becoming members of the board, by becoming members of the community, by becoming members of the Congress. What they really want to do is to have the right to negotiate these issues as partners, external partners with the sports. And if you look at the progress which the player associations have made, they have not only had an equal say, but when sport has been governed in accordance with the fundamental rights of athletes, including freedom of movement, for example, it's exploded as an economic entity because there's been some competition introduced. So I'm a big advocate that athletes have to organise, they have to be parts of unions, they have to be willing to act as a collective, and then the collective will protect the individual. There are many great leaders in the player union movement who have not been exposed like the pioneers were because they've been part of a collective. As far as your specific question about the Athletes Commissions are concerned, they're a stakeholder of management. So they're part of the IOC, they're part of WADA, we will deal with them respectfully as we deal with WADA and the IOC, for example, or an international federation. But they're certainly not representative of the players. And the fact that they're elected does not make them representative of the players when they're elected once, and the only benefit is to ultimately become a member of the governing body of the sport. Because the notion of the way we work is that we're constantly accountable to the players. And whether I keep my job depends on the bargaining outcomes I deliver for the players, not on whether I ultimately will be rewarded by the governing body. In fact, I've been at it for 25 years, and the chances of me getting rewarded by the governing body become less and less every day.
Hold your breath.
Since I've been addressed directly, I want to try to answer that question, and I think it is true that it costs a huge sacrifice for athletes to stand up, and I've tried to somehow back that what everybody knows on a theoretical level. However, I think what Brandon mentioned, the answer must lie outside of formal veto player positions, and I want to pose a question back. Did something happen since Seltmann? So was his sacrifice worth, well, not for him individually, but for the industry of football? I would say yes, because football, since him, became a commercial, well, I wouldn't, FIFA would disagree, but from my perspective, football is a commercial thing. Everybody knows that, and we watch it, like we go to the cinema, for example. But, and then coming back to your question, the Olympic movement is still in that process of, I would call it schizophrenia. On the one hand, it is calling itself a movement trying to instill values in people, and on the other hand, it is a commercial entity and a monopoly, which gives the people that build it no other opportunity but to sign or to go. And I think this is very counteractive to what they actually are supposed, according to their IOC charter, to instill in people. So I think we have to rethink that pyramidal structure. We very much have to rethink the composition of the IOC, and I would urge that the IOC decides whether they want to be a commercial entity and then have contracts with their people that work for them, like football does now. If everything in football falls under the commercial law, for example, of the European Union, but the IOC much more still has this autonomous position, even more than, for example, football, or let's look at the American perspective, baseball and American football. I'm not saying that all the problems will be solved. We still see issues in professional football, in American football, in baseball, but I think that deciding whether it should be a commercial thing or we want to keep with that not well-balanced system is the main issue at the moment.
I think in conjunction with the players unionizing and being represented based on their collective voice, nation states also do need to take responsibility for what's happening. Decades ago, they gifted most autonomy to the sports movement. In Australia and the United States, they own the rights to the Olympic concept, and nation states just gave that to them. And since then, what has happened is that sport has become, seen as a trusted part of society. They were able to evolve completely on their own, creating a whole like sport as Rindum always talks about, that was separate to the rest of society. But they've now lost that trust. Sport has completely lost that trust, and it's time for nation states, communities to say, we're taking the sport back from you because you have violated our trust and you're proving incapable of governing yourself. I think it's really important that we understand that these athletes are citizen athletes. And so when you have a country like Australia, which is violating the rights of its citizen athletes by forcing them to sign athlete agreements where they're forced to go arbitrate in the CAS and circumvent any Australian court or access to remedy in a typical rulemaking fashion. Nation states have a lot to say for that. So I think that's something that I would like to see happen a little bit more.
That's okay. I would, but I think
Okay.
That's okay.
I'd just like to point out this gentleman's question again about the structure. Is there anyone who would like to reply to that? Then we'll have one more question down there.
Just really quickly, I tried to answer that by saying that I think you operate outside the structure. That you organise yourself as a group of players and you deal with that structure. And the question is how much strength you can build as a collective movement as opposed to trying to change the structure. Now that collective movement is not just athletes at the global level. Very, very important. It has to be multi-stakeholder. It's with the human rights watchers, it's with governments, it's with the UN agencies. And try and get to a stage where you're looking at these sports as equally as you possibly can. That's new and it's challenging, but I think it's going to be quicker and bear more fruit, as we've seen in the last 12 months with the human rights commitments, for example, than trying to get in that system and then change it.
Short one, and then one last question on it.
Just brief initial comment. I think the word intervention usually it happens at the national level, but the national level isn't as influenced as it should be. So that's exactly what we have mentioned. There's some kind of interaction between the national level and those activities that take place at the national level based on the national law. And that is public pressure we have to take into consideration.
Okay.
I think you need to take into consideration the degree of modernism. There is something linked to the economy, the sport movement. The Olympic Charter Article 36 is very clear. The Olympic and the Federation goodwill to register in the country of origin, to be harmful to national stage that favors to be
Thank you very much. One last question down there. And
Make
then
it short. As sports is then with a whole baggage of social values and what can do good for society, which goes down the drain whenever money comes in. The question is, would the idea of human rights education on all levels, all age levels and all variations in how much you're professional in sports be a good idea? And what chances would you give it?
I know, but I can't take all questions, so I'm sorry. I have to give it to Jim.
Yeah, I think it would be really important to compare that also to Olympic education, because the IOC spends a lot of money and time brainwashing young people to buy into the values of the movement. I myself was brainwashed, and I propagated those myths in order for New York to try to win its Olympic bid. I went to every school in New York City and talked about how great the Olympics were and why it was going to benefit society and benefit New York City. So I was part of the problem until I saw the light. And so I think that something has to counter that, because right now, all the information, all the messages are coming from the International Olympic Committee, and they are very biased towards what they see as human rights. And so I think it would be very important to see have it come from the rights community.
Yeah, I would agree, and as I said in my presentation, the very presence of an alleged abuser embraced by the Canadian Olympic Committee and the federal government is a form of propaganda. And it's a racist form of propaganda too. And it needs to be seen for that. And also when I finally got some files on this case, it's been going on for 6 years now. And I saw that people like the Canadian Olympic Committee and others, very powerful decision makers in sport in Canada, because I asked the question for the 2013 Play the Game when I presented my paper, Truth, Lies, and History, John Furlong and Canadian Sports Moral Vacuum. I asked the question of all the people on the podium board, how did you determine that Mr. Furlong should stay on your board instead of stepping aside until these allegations are addressed? And you know, one of them wrote, how on earth would we do that? And it's like, well, actually, you could go to Burns Lake and you could talk to First Nations people. Like that, you're rich. You know, you can take a flight up there, you can get up there, you can get the one little motel, and go and talk to Indigenous people. And that is the human rights education. I actually don't really like all those fucking workshops, is what I would call them, that people go to about gender and race. You know, I've been going to them since about 1972. I see the same people. You know, they're still racist, they're still sexist.
Thank you very much. Any more questions from the panel? Or answers? Okay, let's give them a big round of applause. Thank you very much for participating. Now it's lunchtime.